Matai, Weligiskos, or well, nice evening. I'd like to take this time to welcome everybody to the unceded territory of the Ulnu of my ancestors, and I do drum to whenever I come to a gathering. I'm asked to open. I sing a chant that Sarah Denny of Eskasoni taught me to sing whenever nations come together. It's a feast chant or a welcoming chant, and that through my song is what I'm doing. They also say that drumming, dancing are all forms of prayers, and when you sing and drum, it's a double prayer. So I always need double prayers. Ask Marie, she'll tell you. So welcome everyone to our territory, and the drum also represents the heartbeat of our Mother Earth and the heartbeat of our mother. And whenever we drum, we hear that heartbeat that we heard inside of our mother's womb for all that time. And it brings us back to that place where it's the first language that all of us on this earth have learned. And when in our ways, and how I was raised is to always speak from your heart, because when you're speaking from that heart, that drum beat, you're speaking the language of your mother, the first language that everybody understands, and it's the truth. It's the language that is the truth. So I start that tonight because we're going to hear some beautiful words and thoughts, and we're going to share lots from our heart tonight. And so I just hope that helped us get started. Walalio.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for that wonderful opening. Catherine Martin is Dalhousie's Director of Indigenous Community Engagement, and we can look forward to a second performance from her later to close out tonight's event. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'd like to start with the Territorial Acknowledgement. Dalhousie University is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. We are all treaty people. My name is Marla McKay, and I'm the Communications Coordinator for the Dalhousie Libraries. My colleagues and I from the Dal Libraries, librarians Samantha Adema and Deborah Hemming, as well as video conferencing coordinator James Wilson, are thrilled to be on the production team to bring you tonight's book launch with Benita Lawrence. Before we get started introducing our guests, I wanted to review a couple of housekeeping notes. If you want to get closed captions for this event, you should see a button somewhere on your screen that says CC on it. And if you want to ask a question, you can enter your question along the side, and we're going to do our best to get to all of them. If you see a question that someone else has asked, and it was something that you also wanted to ask about, please feel free to give their question a thumbs up, and that will help us to know which questions have the broader interest if we have to start limiting the number of questions that we can take. I've also popped into the chat some links where you can purchase Bonita's book online. And now I'm going to turn things over to Dalhousie student Sings to the Forest, who will introduce tonight's guests. Over to you, Sings to the Forest.
Bonjour à tous, je m'appelle Sings to the Forest et je vais être votre maître de cérémonie pour cet événement. Un peu à propos de moi, je suis graffeur trinidadienne et métis de Toronto et présentement je complète mon baccalauréat en histoire et sciences politiques avec une mineure en études amérindiennes ici à Dalhousie. Hello everyone, my name is Sings to the Forest and I will be one of your hosts this evening. I am a Trinidadian and Métis graffiti artist from Toronto. I am also a third-year student in history and political science with a minor in Indigenous studies here at Dalhousie. I would like to begin by presenting three of our special guests, Sean, Marie, and Bonita. So I'd like to start with Sean. Dr. Sean Hillier is a queer Mi'kmaq scholar from the Kalipu First Nation and was raised on the southwest coast of Newfoundland. He is an assistant professor at the School of Health Policy and Management and special advisor to the Dean on Indigenous Resurgence in the Faculty of Health of York University. He's co-chair of the Working Group on Anti-Black and Anti-Indigenous Racism in the Faculty of Health and the chair of Indigenous Council of York University. Next, we have Dr. Marie Batiste. Dr. Marie Batiste is a full professor in the College of Education at the University of Saskatchewan. A Mi'kmaq from Bottleneck First Nation, she has pursued research advancing Indigenous education, social justice, and institutional change in the decolonization of education, and in particular in teacher education and curriculum, and post-colonial education approaches that recognize and affirm the political and cultural diversity of Canada. She holds graduate degrees from Harvard and Stanford universities and a teacher certificate from the University of Maine, Farmington. She has widely published books, journals, chapters, and reports, and is a widely acclaimed international speaker on Indigenous and decolonizing education. Finally, we have Benita Lawrence, the star of the show this evening. Bonita is a professor in the Indigenous Studies program at York University. Her research and publications have focused primarily on urban, non-status Métis identities, federally unrecognized Aboriginal communities, and Indigenous justice. Along from the novel this evening, she's an author of Fractured Homeland, Federal Recognition, and Algonquin Identity in Ontario, as well as Real Indians and Others, Mixed Blood Urban Native People, and Indigenous Nationhood. So a few housekeeping things before we get started. Bonita will be doing a reading for us this evening, which will be followed by some discussion with our special guest. Following that, Bonita will be doing a second reading, and that second reading will also be followed by more discussion, and at that time we'll also take your questions. Throughout, please feel free to place any questions and comments in the chat as we move forward. We have also placed in the chat some information for accessibility and to rejoin the session if you get disconnected. So I'd like to hand this over for Bonita for the first reading. Miigwech.
Medawalain, I hope you're all doing well, and Walaliak for coming here tonight. I started writing this book with an idea that it would provide a history of Mi'kmaq for young people who grew up off territory. When I took Mi'kmaq language in Toronto, I found a number of young Mi'kmaq people who are very hungry for knowledge of culture and their histories. And I saw them reading a lot of, new age kinds of books. So the book started that way, and then it just sort of took on a life of its own and grew and grew. And I've felt a sense of responsibility about the contents of the book because a lot of literary theorists have talked about the fact that novels addressing Indigenous history have to consider the claims it makes on the past and the present, and therefore on the future. So I've relied primarily on Mi'kmaq sources in the writing that takes place in Mi'kmaq, and there's a big acknowledgement about that. Okay. And with that in mind, I want to briefly mention the book's title. One problem with trying to learn Mi'kmaq language in Toronto through memorizing phrases and words written down, it's hard to be accurate. I ended up confusing the words for I live in England, to I come from England. So Owey, England, does mean I come from England, but it's really about Mi'kmaq people who come from Mi'kmaq, who live in England and other places as well. And I wanted to talk a bit about my own background. My mother's connection to Mi'kmaq was through the reserve in Shediac, New Brunswick, which was broken up by the government in 1895, so before she was born. And my grandmother had some Acadian background and ended up marrying an Acadian. So I don't know if she was a member of the Shediac Reserve, but she was solidly connected to everybody who lived there and people who stayed there after the reserve was broken up, and also people who came from Lennox Island every summer to sell crafts. When my mother was growing up, she was simply told they were all family. So mixed-blooded or not, my mother grew up connected to a Mi'kmaq world. But at a certain point, being mixed blood matters. When she was entering her teens, Mi'kmaq people left Shediac and mostly moved to Eskasoni. But of course, my mother's family had to move to Moncton instead. I never really knew why people had left Shediac at that time, Mi'kmaq people had, until I connected it with Grand Chief Syliboy's attempts to assert Mi'kmaq rights to the forest in the mid to late 1920s. That basically people around Shediac had been driven out of the sources of their livelihoods. So for that reason, my mother's family kind of grew up landless and jobless, and most of them left the Maritimes. My mother went back a few times, and she took me one time to meet people she was still connected to at Eskasoni, who by then were really old. So I kind of wrote this book, I think, to have a kind of a virtual connection to Mi'kmaq for my generation, because we never knew that world, And I'm primarily reading from paper to try and condense a very large sections of novels into readable places. So, and just a brief look, the book's trajectory runs from 1497 to 1985, but I'm going to be reading from two different, very historical chapters, one taking place in London in 1610, when war between Mi'kmaq people and the English was beginning to appear inevitable. But when it starts off, the Mi'kmaq world is intact, and so Mi'kmaq people can live anywhere, you know, without ever having to worry about loss of culture or anything like that. But that changes as the novel, as that chapter takes place. And I wanted to acknowledge that some of the information in the chapters from a range of English sources, but The Mi'kmaq Concordat by Sakich Henderson is something I've relied on very heavily for part of this chapter. So I'm going to read from chapter 5, and the woman's name is Mimigisbert, and the title of the chapter is The Turning Point. In most places in England, Patrick and I would not easily be accepted. Fortunately, most of the folk who stay at the Mariner's Rest are sailors, as well as merchants involved in shipping. The sailors have been all over the world. The presence of an Irish papist at an inn owned by women, let alone dark-skinned women, is of little concern. And since the merchants are interested only in making money, they know that they must not let religion, the king, or anything else stand in their way. Patrick works for my mother, but he now shares my bed, and has found his succor here. But I will not marry him. Like our old Queen Bess, I'll enjoy my lover, but remain in charge of my own domain. She was not your queen, Patrick would say harshly, if he heard me voicing such words out loud. Nor mine. The great whore brought nothing but misery to my land, nor will her successor serve your land any better. But his dark words roll off me. I'm gentle with him, for Patrick is a wounded man, partially crippled in body and nearly destroyed in the soul, after the old Queen's campaign to oust the Irish chieftains and impose English law across Ireland caused so much misery. My grandmother Cicely, sympathetic to the Irish for all that she is pure English, has told me much about what happened, and Patrick has told me the rest. How Ulster, under Hugh O'Neill, became the heart of Irish resistance, and he nearly succeeded in uniting all of Ireland against the English until finally the warships and the troops captured and occupied each region, destroying crops and livestock until the will to fight was gone and Ireland was finally subjugated. To permanently destroy Celtic Ulster's resistance, though, the British began importing Scots settlers, but the Scots were frightened to settle in Ireland at the time in case there was more uprisings, even though they passed the Articles of Plantation, which awarded 2,000 acres of the best Irish land to the settlers. The Scots still hesitated. So finally, Chichester's troops systematically killed all of the Irish in large parts of Antrim and Down. Patrick, from County Down, saw his whole family murdered, and when he collapsed with a head wound and a broken leg, was left for dead by British troops. The survivors collected the wounded and brought them to healers. Patrick's head wound healed, and his broken leg was set and bound to wooden staves. They feared the leg would rot. However, he managed to keep his leg, but he has a permanent limp. He came here seeking work as soon as he could walk, as many of the Irish did after losing their own land to the Scots settlers. He was fully a man in his late 20s when I met him. If we were in Mi'kma'ki, there would have been many old people to watch me as my womanhood approached, to make sure I did not tie up my heart with somebody chosen in the moment of passion. They would have been there for advice too. But here in England, without the elders and my father's absence, with only my mother and grandmother around, preoccupied with running our inn, there was nobody but me to judge Patrick's suitability. And from the start, that was based on the deep bodily attraction I felt for him the moment I saw him. My mother realized that the intensity with which I seemed to feel everything was clearly a sign that I was becoming a woman emotionally. She said at this time at home, I should have been fasting and going out on the land for days by myself. However, in Deptford, this was impossible, so we found a compromise. She put Cicely and Patrick in charge of the inn and took me out past Deptford Creek. Although the dock had been built, there was still open land further on in those days, where the sounds of the dock could not be heard. She had acquired a length of canvas with which she fashioned a rough shelter within a copse of trees. She brought me some water and some tobacco that we had brought from our homeland. And there for 4 days, I sat there, out of sight and hearing of my mother. Although unknown to me, she was nearby, watching intently to make sure nobody disturbed me. At night, unknown to me, it was Patrick who guarded my safety, the matchlock musket that he had taken from a British officer ready at his hands. After 4 days, my mother took me back home, where I washed myself before I broke my fast and slept. I woke to a much clearer mind and heart. Somehow my emotions were in balance again. I was happy that my mother had the knowledge from our homeland to know what to do when the heart and mind are conflicted and raging out of control. My mother is Mi'kmaq from Epiquet. On my father's side, I'm the granddaughter of the young man who was kidnapped from Unama'ki by John Cabot in 1497, who had taken the name Henry Bear in England. My grandfather became a navigator. My father says that he spoke several languages, Arabic, Latin, and English, as well as Mi'kmaq, of course, although the knowledge of his own language grew rusty after years with from lack of use. For years, he shipped out from a place called Aden, my English grandmother told me, and navigated ships back and forth from the Indies. She said he had the wanderlust then, and that he ended up staying there almost 40 years, speaking only Arabic for most of that time. So he wouldn't have been able to survive back in your homeland, she told me, after all that time away, especially since he had just turned 16 when he was kidnapped. My father was named after his father, Henry Bear. My grandfather brought him to Mi'kmaq when he was just weaned on a fishing trip bound for Tarumcook, that they call Newfoundland here. Hearing my grandfather's story of being kidnapped away from his home, the captain went out of his way to make a quick landing on the coast of the mainland. And so, almost 50 years after my grandfather had been kidnapped away from his homeland, he returned to Unama'ki with a little boy. He was welcomed and fed by the people there, even though they did not know him. He finally managed to find his older brother, and they had a powerful reunion. His brother adopted my father and swore that his descendants would care for our descendants always. They stayed in Unama'ki long enough for my father to learn Mi'kmaq, while my grandmother Cicely hired a number of assistants and ran the inn in their absence. To return, they were canoed over to Tarumcook by members of my grandfather's family, where they caught another fishing boat back to London. My grandfather died shortly afterwards, happy for having provided for his son and for the reunion that he had finally had with his brother. My grandmother Cicely raised my father, kept the inn running with the help of a manager, and as my father grew up, he tended the inn with his mother. But gradually, as my father approached his 30s, he became aware from the ship's captains that stayed at our inn that men like Walter Raleigh were bringing native people to London and keeping them there until they had learned enough English to tell them about their homelands. I believe even then that my father distrusted the English and believed that they would someday try to make inroads into our territory. He began to travel periodically to Mi'kmaq to share information with the Sagamawak there. As a child, my mother was nicknamed Jiklikich, for she was both very bold and very tiny, like a chickadee. Her childhood was spent in Epiquet, but when her father died, her family went to live with her mother's sister in Unama'ki. When she met my father, she was fascinated by the strangeness of being with somebody whose features and language were clearly Mi'kmaq, but who was more familiar with European ways than those of his homeland. The fascination eventually grew to love. When she and my father pledged their troth to each other, she followed my father back to England. And it was impossible for my father, because he had grown up in England, to provide her with a living in Mi'kmaq. So my mother had to adapt to life in Deptford in order to be with my father, and she grew to like it. As time passed, however, my father was increasingly troubled at the numbers of native people now being brought to England. When the Virginia colony was established in the lands of the Powhatan Confederacy, my father decided to return to Mi'kmaq to share his news and learn what the strategies of the Sagamawak would be to those encroachments to the south. He traveled there in 1608, shortly after Patrick came to work for us, and ended up staying for almost 2 years. With the depth of my attraction to Patrick, I missed my father's presence, his guidance as to whether Patrick should be considered a good man, a suitable man for me. But after fasting out on Deptford Creek, my mind was clearer. I yearned to talk to my mother about Patrick, but I feared she would dismiss any thought of him as a suitor for me, and finally I realized might dismiss him as well. So I kept silent. And yet, on the weekend that my mother went out of town to shop for supplies for the inn, as Patrick and I sat there after hours, nibbling on leftovers and drinking some of the leftover ale that was there, we grew closer and closer until finally I accompanied him into his room and shared his bed. When my mother returned 2 days later, it didn't take her more than a few minutes watching how Patrick and I pretended not to know each other to know that something was afoot. She waited until Patrick was tending the horses before coming up behind me as I folded linen. "Mimicus," she started abruptly. Her use of my spirit name startled me, and I turned around, guiltily hanging my head. "Did you sleep with Patrick?" she asked, without further ado. My wordlessness answered her. "You cannot fool around with this man, Indus," she exclaimed. "He's experienced atrocity. He's witnessed his whole family being murdered. After he recovered from his wounds, it took a long time until he stopped wanting to die." "And Hitch, I can't walk away from him," I responded slowly. "I didn't want this to happen, but there seemed to be no way for me to hold back. But he scares me a little. There's such hurt in him, such anger. He's very gentle with me, but there's no lightness to him." "Then you have chosen your partner, Indus," she said wearily. Despite your fear, I think you've chosen well. He's a good man and a strong man. He will not do you wrong. When Patrick sat down with us that night, I preempted his words with my own announcement. I do not want to be betrothed. I will cleave to you, Patrick, and to you alone, but I want no ceremony sealing us together in a tie that will suffocate us. My mother was fine with that. Patrick, on the other hand, was discomfited, but ultimately accepting. I was always taught that the church, representing God, put man and woman together to bring forth children, he said. But then where was the church when we were being butchered? His eyes, however, were anxious. I could tell that part of him wanted me tied to him, lock and key, under his control, that my freedom inflamed his ever-present fear of loss. When my first child was born, we lay awake for hours that first night. Patrick curled around me and cradled to me as I lay on my side, curled around the child, who was latched onto my breast, suckling hard and making small grunts of pleasure as he tugged at the nipple. We slept that way, the baby sleeping at my nipple. Joy and wonder were palpable in the air that night for both of us. I think for Patrick especially, this new title represented a new start, as fearful as he was to accept it. My father returned from Mi'kmaq shortly afterwards, full of joy for his first grandchild, but at the same time full of news. My father has learned that the French represent a much more immediate potential threat to Mi'kmaq than the English do. They have long fished in Taganrog's waters, but a century ago, when Gisakama Membertou was very young, they began trading furs along the long river, stretching from Quebec to Quetejac lands. Back then, they had even planted a cross in Quebec, attempting to claim the area for France. We had convinced them otherwise. More recently, though, they had established a colony in Quebec, which the French named Port Royal. The Mi'kmaq seer, Masamuet, who had once traveled to France, had been dreaming of a way for the Mi'kmaq nation to deal with the Europeans, who seemed to be encroaching from all sides. The beautiful way that he finally developed was for Gisakama Membertou to negotiate an alliance with Rome. Membertou knew that England and France both followed the religion of the crucified man, but that for some reason their religious paths had divided. Perceiving the Catholic religion to have the strongest Manitou, Membertou had presented a wampum belt to the priests negotiating on behalf of Rome, who have promised that the Mi'kmaq freedom of religion if they ally themselves with Rome. A massive wampum belt has been sent with them to Rome to mark this alliance. Mi'kmaq is now politically a Catholic nation, an ally of France rather than a subject nation. This means that the French cannot establish settlements on our lands without our permission. However, our nation has a choice. While all of our members who accept the alliance have been baptized, nobody has to accept the Catholic Manitou as part of their spirituality unless they choose to. Patrick was the one who was most impressed at our Gisakama strategy. It's just like Ireland, he chortled in a rare mood of merriment. When St. Patrick came, the Celts converted, but they made the church follow our ways. It became a Celtic church. And that was the basis of possibility for the French and the Spanish to come to our aid against the British. Sobering quickly, however, he offered a cautionary warning. In the end, the French and the Spanish betrayed us and refused to come to our aid. Maybe they saw us as too different from the other nations. We took a different route from them in life. The Roman Empire never shattered us. Our church was Celtic, theirs was not, and we had Brehon laws and a high king who ruled with the consent of the other kings. He stopped and thought a little before continuing. Is this how your Mi'kmaq nation works as well? That your Gisakama rules only with the consent of the other Sagamuak? As we nodded in assent, he concluded his thoughts. By the time the Europeans subjugated their own lands, the Viking attacks had shattered our unity and we were fighting among ourselves, and that allowed the English to get a toehold on our lands. And those we thought were our allies in the faith betrayed us in the end. We fought the English alone. Your Membertou will have to be careful. Like us, you follow too different a path in life from the Europeans. In the end, your European allies may not support you. Even though my parents are both Mi'kmaq and I am fluent in the language, I consider myself to be an Englishwoman. I was born here, and except for a trip to our homeland when I was a baby, I've always lived here. But I supported what my father was doing. Perhaps it comes from being with Patrick, who from bitter experience knows how the English can force their ways upon each other. And I'm starting to see the power of the English here in Deptford, how they're building seemingly endless quantities of new ships. I do not think anything can protect our homeland from the English, should they decide to descend upon us. By 1641, we no longer paid attention to any of the visitors from the Americas who continued to come to London. The man from the Mosquito Coast, whom they called a prince, the Munsey man from the Dutch-occupied territory called Jacks, among others. We were struggling to keep Patrick alive and sane during the Irish Rebellion, especially when Cromwell massacred almost 3,500 people at Drogheda and confiscated all Catholic land holdings. During the long, hard years that Cromwell was in power here, at times we had to hide Patrick from Cromwell's soldiers to ensure he was not arrested. Indeed, we even built a small hidden room at the inn for him to hide in whenever the soldiers were near. In that small room, many times I held him after the soldiers left, as he cried on my shoulder for the loss of his home, his family, his people. It was not until the terrible plague of 1665 that I lost my mother, but at the same time I also lost Patrick. I'm bereft and cannot be consoled to it. Only the desperation that the entire city experienced kept me from seeking my own end at the time. The rich left the city early and all businesses shut down, while the poor could not leave until certificates of health were produced. Finally, those who could leave were turned away from neighboring towns and simply starved to death in the countryside. This plague far outstripped the one in 1625, where I lost my father. By August, the mortuary bills listed over 7,000 dead a week, and 31,000 for the entire month, but many more were uncounted. Most of the poor were simply dumped in burial pits in their parishes, no attempt to even count them. They did keep track at the Aldgate Parish Church, where over 1,100 people were buried in one pit. Another one in Finsbury Fields was easily as big. The plague orders could not be obeyed. The death carts could not handle them all, and so bodies were simply stacked outside of houses until they could be brought for burial. It was not until February 1666 that the death rate slowed down considerably, and the king and most of the wealthy merchants returned to London. We were a much smaller city immediately after the plague. At least a third of London's population was gone. But by September, however, a fire in Pudding Lane raged out of control, and soon the entire city within the walls was on fire. We were safe in Deptford, but we filled the inn with the homeless, let many others camp on our grounds around us. 2 of my sons were at sea when the fire happened, transporting loads of goods to the Atlantic colonies. My firstborn, Sakej, however, is in Mi'kma'ki. He will not be returning. He has renounced all connection with England and will live and die under Mi'kmaq law. I heard recently from some of the captains who have long been guests at our inn that war has broken out again in our homeland. The war began over English slaving in our territories, and it did not go well for our men. I believe my son survived, though. I think I would feel it in my heart if he was dead. The war will continue, however. Things have changed very fast since the days when my father first voiced his concerns to the Sagamuak. The English are now everywhere along the Atlantic coast. Between 1620, when the group claiming to be religious refugees landed in Abenaki territory and were so shocked to be hailed, "Hello, Englishmen!" by the Sachem Samoset, who had learned English from the fishermen on Monhegan Island, to a little over a decade after my father's death, 7 additional colonies were established in the territories of our allies and further south. In my father's day, there were probably only about 2,000 Englishmen in all of Great Turtle Island. Now the merchants estimate there are 200,000 English just along the coast south of our lands. The people from Great Turtle Island that arrive here now are often impoverished and engaged in great struggle. Wampas, who is from the Nipmuc people, whose confederacy is south of ours, was a negotiator between the Nipmuc and the Massachusetts colony. He came here independently, appealing directly to King Charles for succor for his people. In debt for 50 shillings for his passage and costs, he was thrown into a debtor's prison for 6 months, was not allowed to sell any lands to get himself released. We've heard that when he landed in Boston after King Charles finally freed him, he became a drunken profligate. They say he was thrown into prison in Cambridge, where he died. What is even worse is that many of our people are now arriving as slaves, probably captured during their ongoing struggles to protect their lands. It seems the English prefer them young. The newspapers advertise runaways from slavery all the time, and many of them are young native boys who are presumably kept as pets by the owners. While some of the young girls run away, still wearing the metal collars that are used to chain them for God knows what kind of sexual perversions. We are now talked about in the news as the Red Race. Not as nations, and certainly not as people. My sons, Henry and Patrick, do not concern themselves with the fate of these captives, nor with what is said about our people. They've each become ship's captains, taking their own consignments of trade goods to and from Barbados. They're turning a handsome profit on their voyages. Both of them work with the same interests, exporting machine parts to Barbados to enable more and more sugarcane to be processed, and importing sugar. Because of seasonal demands, they often take secondary voyages, importing fish from Taugumcook or Newfoundland as they call it. I'm torn at their success. Any mother is anxious that her sons might have a good livelihood. And yet the reality is that this Atlantic trade, which is escalating year after year, is a world built on the invasion of our worlds and the misery and enslavement of our own people, as well as those of Africa. My sons are profiting from the destruction of their ancestors' world, and they have the taint of African slavery on their own hands, although they will not see it that way. Loneliness haunts me. I yearn so strongly for the past that at times it almost consumes me. It's not only Patrick I yearn for and the years of our passionate lovemaking and the wonder of producing our children. I'm lonely for my parents, for being immersed in a world where we spoke our language constantly among ourselves. I'm lonely for the days when I could confidently consider myself to be both a Mi'kmaq and an Englishwoman, when both worlds seemed open to us. Those days are gone. I should have listened to Patrick when he used to tell me that the English would deal no better with my world than they did with his. Ireland should have been a lesson to all of us, but true to my namesake, the butterfly, I was intent on my own path and heeded him not. Cicely still knows Mi'kmaq, but my sons, when they are in town, no longer speak the language with me at all. They do not consider themselves to be Mi'kmaq, nor do they identify with their father, Patrick O'Callaghan. They've not even taken his anglicized name of Callahan. They do not identify with poor brutalized Ireland. They consider themselves to be English. And who would not choose to be on the winning side? My children will all take English partners, will marry them in the Christian way, and will raise their children to be English. When the renovations of the inn are complete, I'll be going back to Mi'kmaq to live. I was only there when I was a baby and only for a few months, but my parents' families may still be around. If I survive the voyage, I hope I'll be able to find a place for myself. Perhaps I will even find Sackage before I die. England, this land I once loved and considered so fair, that has fed us for so long, is now consuming us. In the end, I too have had to choose. Thank you. So I'll pass it to Margaret Robinson now.
Thanks, Bonita. Hi, I'm Margaret Robinson. I coordinate the Indigenous Studies program here at Dalhousie, and you're at Benita Lawrence's book launch for Nindelaway, England, Sojourns in England. I know our discussants have lots of questions, so we'll begin with Marie Batiste. Over to you, Marie.
Great, Walali, Walaliek, and Welly Walak is in our evening. So good evening to you. Although my day is still here in Saskatoon, where I'm on Treaty 6 territory, and the sun has yet to go down in our territory here. But nonetheless, I'm just delighted to first to be here, to be able to engage with this wonderful book, which I haven't had a chance to read. I'm getting the snippets of what you had. And, you know, the thing that interests me, but first of all, how I know you. And I know you as a researcher. I know you as an academic. I know you as in the writings that you've done. Your work that you did on anti-racism and decolonization has been one of those, you know, stellar little pieces that I always have in my classes. And so I'm going to first of all turn to your life around this, because I'm not clear about your characters. And before I get to that, I want to know how you went through a process of first. I'm struck with the first part of your talk that you said you did this in order to really find out about yourself. And so I'm gathering by the character that you have that character is someone who is an ancestor of yours. And so there is part fiction, part real in both of those. And so how much of this is this person that you're drawing from in England? How much of that is your known ancestor?
Actually, none of it. Oh, sorry.
None of it.
No. My father was from England, so I had a chance to go there when I was younger. So I obviously know London, but he wasn't around for most of my life, so it was mainly my mother. So I think my father's done some ancestry tracing in the UK. I haven't paid a lot of attention to it because so much more of our ancestry is so much more of a struggle to find out about in Mi'kmaq, right? So that's been, I wrote I wanted to start it, it's ironic, when I did my book launch in Toronto, I wrote entirely from the perspective of Mi'kma'ki. But I think I wanted to start the one in the UK to show a couple of things. First of all, that you could write a book that had sections taking place in England without, while still being relevant for Mi'kmaq history. You know, it takes a few minutes to get into it, but that's partly why it wasn't really based on a character at all. I knew that I wanted to include some of England in the book. Like I say, I first started doing it just to, my idea was to write about Mi'kmaq history so that people who grew up off the territory would have something else to read than, you know, sort of things that weren't as relevant. But then it took off and had a mind of its own. And the other thing is that when you write your first book in your 60s, you tend to throw in everything, right? So I hadn't looked at I was in England when I was 19 to the age of 24, almost 25. So those experiences were really formative. So I think I wanted to write about Mi'kmaq people in England, both as a way of, I have a character who's telling this, who's doing the research, right? He's the one who's finding out all these things. He's based in the 70s, and he's there because half of his ancestry is English and half is Mi'kmaq, and he wants to bring both parts of his ancestry together. I think for me, it was less my ancestry than my own experience there. Of course, I couldn't live there if my father hadn't been from there. You know, but yeah, so I think, and I also, I wanted to write the book beginning with different parts of Mi'kmaq life, like the time when the world was intact, the time when invasion seemed on the horizon, and that's the time of this novel. She starts off, I can be English and Mi'kmaq, it doesn't matter. I speak my language. We're all speaking our language. We all identify as Mi'kmaq, but I can be English too. By the end of it, that's not possible. You know, by then it's a colonial world, right? So I wanted to mark that passage. There are other people throughout the book who end up in England, who are impressed into the Navy, and always they're in a place that's the heart of the empire, right? But that first, this chapter that I did was, you know, we're free to be where we want to live. You know, we're still Mi'kmaq when we live a Mi'kmaq life, even though we're living in England, and even though I identify that, you know, I'm English, I was born here, but I'm Mi'kmaq. By the end of the story, that's not possible anymore, and it pre-shadows the next chapter, which is all about the war. You know, I wrote the next chapter is about 2 generations of her son and his son, all still fighting, you know, in Mi'kmaq, right? So. Yeah, it was strange but I think because I thought people must find it strange that this is about Mi'kmaq people in England. So I wanted to show that it could still be connected to Mi'kmaq history, because always I tried to reflect what was happening historically. And it goes up to 1985 in a fictional community, of course. You know,
I'm very interested in how you navigate in the research. There has been tremendous amount of prejudice and discrimination, racism, that pervades literature about Mi'kmaq people. You go to the Jesuit relations, for example. You go to Christian Leclerc, and Christian Leclerc was a very important person in my own research. I recall the day that I discovered that book in the Fredericton Library, and I started to read it and was engrossed with it, and finally convinced the librarian at the end of the day that I wouldn't steal the book and I would bring it back on Monday morning if she would let me take it out and finish reading it over the weekend. And so I pled my case well, but I also was an instructor at UNB that year for the Mi'kmaq program that they had there. And so navigating the eyes of these outsiders looking on Mi'kmaq people with all of that racism and prejudice against them, but yet underneath, what after you strip away the racism and the characterization, I saw my people. I saw the threads of my people. I heard the laughter. I heard them making fun, telling stories. I could imagine it, and I was like filled with, pride with that, as well as, anger at the way they were talked about. In your research, how do you then, from that kind of lens of these different people, how do you navigate a positive projection on Mi'kmaq people?
Well, I have a character who's a scholar, and he's the one who's doing this research that is becoming the book. And he talks about the archives, being in the archives at Oxford, right? The Bodleian, and the tremendous racism, but that he's mining these sources. So I do reference that. Because I wasn't doing primary research, I was doing secondary research. As you know, I relied on so many Mi'kmaq writers, to make sure that my fiction in Mi'kmaqi was accurate, because that was my main concern, right? That if you write something that's about history, you have to make sure that it's accurate. So yeah, so it wasn't a book of primary research, and I was used to doing social science research, but the decision to write a novel just came from I think it was reading Jace Weaver's The Red Atlantic, right? And I thought, looking at Native people in Europe is a really interesting way of trying to get those two halves together, and then of course I wanted to focus on Mi'kmaq people, especially later in the book. He also is talking about other people coming, it's not always just Mi'kmaq people, but the stories are always about Mi'kmaq people, and most of them increasingly as we get into more modern times. Pre-World War I, for example, it really starts in the Shediac community. I imagine my grandmother, right? And I talk about her, and then her daughter goes to war, and then she comes back, and it's a fictional community, Kuchibugwak, right? It's near Eskasoni, but not Eskasoni. So yeah, and when she comes back, it's much more about the opening of the school, Shubenacadie, how that, removed. They on some reserves they had Mi'kmaq people teaching kids, and that all ended with the residential school. And then as that section ends, the relocations are starting. So it's different parts of history, but as I say, it was all secondary. It's not like I spent a lot of time in the archives that you did, for example. I relied on all the work that everybody else, that people like you did in the archives to write the novel, because just writing fiction alone, I've never written fiction before, right? And I wanted to try it. It was actually a good friend of mine. He wrote a novel. Brian McLeod, he sort of said, "Do you want to have a read of this?" And I thought, I'm reading. He wrote a novel, and I read it, and the dialogue was good, and I thought, hey, maybe I can try that. So that's how it all started, and a desire as well, as I got older, to unhinge myself a bit from the straight academic mind. There's so much more you can explore in fiction than you can in but it relies on, as I say, people like yourself who've done the primary research.
I'm going to turn it over to Sean, perhaps.
Okay.
Thanks. Now we're going to hear from Sean Hillier, who's got questions for Benita Lawrence as well. Over to you, Sean.
Quay. Good evening, everyone. I join you from traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And I want to thank Catherine for the beautiful opening to start us off today in a good way. And Benita, thank you for inviting me to be on the panel today. I'm honored to work with you at York and to call you a friend. And I want to start off by saying how much I love this book. This was a fairly last minute agreement to come onto the panel, and I was like, I don't know how much of the book I'll get through, but I have to say, once I started, I was captivated and engaged and haven't put it down since. And a lot of that had to do with what you said at the very beginning, is that I think for a lot of Mi'kmaq people is that we haven't had a lot of our history of our teachings. And so for me, this was an opportunity to really grasp in, and as a scholar, but also you know, as a human, to really fall in love with a vivid characterization and the imagery that you portray throughout your chapters and throughout your characters. And something really stood out to me, one of the quotes out of this chapter that you actually say, and it was that I knew more of my English ways than of my Mi'kmaq ways. And that always struck a chord, and something that I really took up as I was reading through this, and the interconnectedness of culture, of family, of tradition that you have as you start out at chapter 1, and how that weaves through up until the late 1980s. And I'm going to confess, I wasn't even born when the timeline ends. And so for me, this this was a very interesting aspect. And I just want to know a little bit from you. What made you do this? And I know that you talk about this, but I think this kind of fundamental piece of being Mi'kmaq, but the recognition and those types of things, and how that really played out in your want and drive to write this book for others.
I think it started. Gabe Marshall from Eskasoni used to teach us Mi'kmaq language right in Toronto, and we were lucky because it's not a Ontario language, and how language is taught. You can learn Anishinaabe, or you can learn one of the Haudenosaunee languages, or Cree, but you can't learn Mi'kmaq in Toronto. So we were lucky. The Native Center just gave us a basement room. They weren't using it. But he spent so much time talking about culture. I mean, Catherine, when you were singing, he turned us on to Mi'kmaq music. To so much really things. We learned far more about that than we did about language, because one of the problems was, I think most of the people there didn't believe they could learn. Most of the Mi'kmaq students hadn't finished high school, right? Their parents had grown up in Mi'kmaq, but they had grown up in Toronto, and they just didn't believe they could learn the language, so they were anxious for the culture. I was trying to learn the language too, so I'd be memorizing everything and nobody to practice it with. I mean, other than Gabe himself, right? So it was partly that, seeing all of those students who didn't have any chance of, it would be easier for me as a student to gather these histories, and so much that Gabe taught us, right? And then reading everything that I found, my library, anything that's Mi'kmaq was there, right? So that was what started it. But then the throwing in the English part was really a part about having lived there when I was young, right? And not so much about my father's ancestry, because as I say, I was just raised by my mother. So it was her that was all of our interests, not him. But yeah, it started off with that desire, and then as I say, when I saw the Red Atlantic, and he was talking about Mi'kmaq people, but not Mi'kmaq people, but Indigenous peoples in England or in Europe, that also took me in a different direction. I wish now that I had, in some ways, written 2 books, one about England and Mi'kmaq, and one that I originally wanted to write. But it happens though it does. I don't know if I've answered you though, but it was about that lack of knowledge, that when you grow up outside, and it's not something, other than trying to do research myself, going down there, which I would have loved to have done, right? If I'd been able to get a job in Mi'kmaq, my life would be very different. Same as you, right? If you end up knowing so much more just from living there, but it didn't happen that way. So yeah, it was a desire also to learn myself about all of this, and to gather together what I did know, and then everything that I'd read for so long from Mi'kmaq writers, to try and put it all together, Yeah.
That's beautiful, and I think the vivid imagery, as I've talked about before, if you haven't read it yet, the storyline that you piece together, you know, the imagery as you start to get in the later chapters around starvation and dying and infectious disease. But as a health researcher, I was just like, oh, there's so much here that I could use to help explain to my students and to you know, Canadians really what's happened. And I think moving into Black History Month, there are these really interesting constructions around identity and relationship and family connection that many people are unaware of within the East Coast, and trying to bring those to light I found to be extremely interesting as we get through some of the later chapters around the connection to Indigenous people, Black communities, Indian communities, Muslim family connections was very powerful. And so I thank you for that.
Thank you. One of the things I learned, I guess I'll wait for a second until, yes. I was going to talk about at the beginning of the next chapter, but it was ironic. A student of mine who's from one of the Black communities in Nova Scotia, she said that the the elders in her community, and I'm not going to name it because, you know, it's her story, not mine. They've talked about how they settled there. When they settled there, they had found some Mi'kmaq women who were hiding. Now, that was after the American Revolution, after scalping proclamations had ended, but they hadn't actually been repealed. And they ended up having their settlement there. It wasn't, I don't know how many I can't remember how many they mentioned, but that, you know, Mi'kmaq people were really still in trouble then. So they actually settled right there, right? And they now are tracing their Mi'kmaq ancestry. But yeah, so that connection of obviously I explore in the next section that I'll be reading. So yeah. So I don't know if, do you have other questions, or should we go back to Margaret, or?
I'm good with questions. Marie?
Wonderful. Thanks, Sean, and thanks, Marie. Now we'll put Bonita back on the hot seat and have her read another excerpt from her novel. Back to you, Bonita.
All right then. Thank you. I also didn't do my own land acknowledgement. I'm living on unceded Algonquin territory here in Eastern Ontario. And I wanted to start by saying there's two sources for this chapter. One is Daniel Paul's We Were Not the Savages, as well as Darlene Ricker's Alsitcook, The Story of the Bear River Community, and some online sources as well. And the thing, in this chapter, I talk a lot about the scalping proclamations. I don't think there's been any estimates as to how many people might have vanished to bounty hunters in Mi'kmaq. But when the governor of Massachusetts offered £100 for every male Mi'kmaq scalp and £50 for every woman or child, we have to consider that the average income for a skilled worker in Massachusetts at the time was probably £20 to £25 a year at the most. So even one scalp taken was a fortune, right? So the numbers that were taken must have been large, which, you know, I think accounts for the tremendous population collapse, even with disease. Even with Cornwallis's offer of £10 a year and then raised to £50, it was a fortune, right? And I've chosen to say in this chapter that many, many people vanished at that time to bounty hunters. I think one day also it'd be very interesting to conduct research as to how much wealth was acquired by bounty hunters, and actually how much wealth in Massachusetts maybe had its origin there. So I do start with that. And the previous chapter focused on, you know, the beginning of the war. I have a chapter that focused on the Long Wars, but this takes place decades after the burying of the hatchet ceremonies, and when Mi'kmaq people were attempting to survive under British domination. And the character is named Melissa Kakwa, and it's 1783 after the treaties. Hunger has become a way of life. The gaping emptiness inside, the barren ground outside, as all possible edibles are stripped from the land without a thought to leave a few plants to regenerate. The desperate willingness to do anything for anybody who offers food. The weakness that makes us such easy prey for the wasting disease of consumption and the terrible whooping cough where we struggle with our last strength to catch our breath. But then there are so many new diseases that rage through our communities. We're all numb, the survivors. So many children and old people have died that I believe we're scarcely alive. Only our hunger tells us we're still here. When my parents were young, they were part of the tiny village of Ositkuk. Both my grandparents hunted together. My grandmother had become a good hunter while my grandfather was at war. There was still moose meat and deer meat and their skins to keep them warm. Both their mothers, who were good friends, lived with them and did most of the sewing. These days we beg for food and blankets. They're talking about finally providing us with access to land, 30 acres per family so we can farm. How can we stop farming, as the British want us to, without food to make us strong enough to work? The men we have left in our communities, so many have been taken by the British for showing the least resistance. Try to hunt, but the woods around here are being replaced by settlers' fields, and most of the animals are gone. I'm only in my late teens, yet in many ways I feel like an old woman. Since the food got very scarce, I've stopped menstruating. Women need food to be fertile. I believe that's why we're birthing so many children these days. Getting to this place of desperation took a long, long time. My mother used to tell us stories from her mother about the long wars we fought against the British, and how after the first peace treaty, our Smaknizak did not submit peacefully, but how brutally they were punished whenever they rebelled. How many of our men were captured and sold into slavery at the time. So when Britain declared war against Spain in 1744, our men took the opportunity to rise up against the British again. At that point, Governor Shirley of Massachusetts set a bounty of £100 for every male Indian killed and £50 for every woman and child killed. After that, it was not only rape from the British soldiers and some of the settlers that we feared. Gorham's Rangers, the bloodthirstiest of men, hounds for hire, were brought into Nova Scotia from Massachusetts to collect bounties for our scalps. It was terrifying in the villages, my mother told me. She would tell of the days when the women had lookouts around all our villages. At the first sight of a white man, they would tell the children assisting us, and the children would run to all of the wigwams and warn everybody. Then they would run into the woods and hide under the cover of thorn thickets, or the younger women who were stronger would take their babies up high into the trees. Children had already learned the art of silence from their mothers. They had made a game out of it, so that the child who could stay silent the longest would be rewarded. Babies were suckled to ensure that they did not cry. Their mothers' breasts were used to stop up their mouths so they could not inadvertently betray their mother's presence. My grandfather, who survived years of warfare, vanished at that time, as did several of my uncles and cousins. Many of our friends and neighbors also vanished at that time. Our chiefs sued for peace in 1749, accepting the terms of the 1725 treaty. But the British were vengeful. More settlers were being encouraged to come in, more of our lands were forfeit. When our nation did not submit to having our lands taken, Governor Cornwallis announced his own scalping proclamations. This time it was £10 for every scalp, man, woman, or child. More of our friends, as well as all of my aunts and my remaining cousins, vanished around that time. Typhus carried off my grandmother soon afterwards. To make our survival even more tenuous, Cornwallis ordered the soldiers to burn the forests that we relied on for hunting. A year later, Cornwallis raised the bounty to £50 per scalp. Those were truly times of terror, my mother told me, when whole families vanished as if they had never existed. Finally, in 1752, under pressure from the new governor of Massachusetts, Spencer Phipps, who wanted peace with the Mi'kmaq, Cornwallis repealed the proclamation and asserted that no Indian should be harmed. However, the following year, a Mi'kmaq family of 7 was murdered for their scalps. The offenders were not prosecuted. It was a message to our people that despite this repeal, this system of terror would be permanent. We were attempting to submit to what the British called peace, when 3 years later, every Acadian who did not swear an oath of fealty to the British and their church were ordered to leave Acadia. In their villages, people were rounded up and dragged onto ships. Our people fought back to protect them. They had been our allies and friends for so long. And we sheltered those who managed to escape. They became part of our communities. As punishment for fighting back and coming to the assistance of the Acadians, another proclamation was made, offering £25 for every Mi'kmaq man's scalp and £25 for every woman or child brought in alive. My mother was convinced that they wanted women and their children captured to breed them with our enslaved men in far-off places like Barbados. At that point, despite years of hunger, a number of the women of her generation were still able to have children. My mother survived, but the rest of her brothers and sisters and their children, my father's family was already gone, vanished. My mother was convinced they would not stop until we were all destroyed. They never repealed that proclamation. So even after the active hunting of Mi'kmaq people finally ceased, for my generation it hung above us at every turn, threatening us if we tried to revolt, encouraging us to submit. And settlers came in from Massachusetts, bringing slaves with them from Africa. Soon they'd settled on our lands, so that more of us were landless and hungry. By the 1760s, our nation had sued for peace unconditionally. We now were no longer able to trade with any of the ships that came into port. My mother and many other women of her generation had grown to rely on that trade. Their work had fed us. Their quillwork cases and chairbacks, their woven baskets and embroidered tea cozies had all been commissioned in England. The ship captains had brokered our trade with these unknown English buyers, returning with money that enabled us to buy food and blankets. For years now, we'd been allowed to trade at truck houses set up at certain points where we could trade fish or meat to the British. But this gradually became almost pointless. In many regions, the animals steadily grew fewer, and we grew even hungrier. The settlers took most of the best places where we had fished as well. Eventually, the truck houses were useless. There was no surplus of anything left to trade. It grew still worse as years went by. I was still a young girl when the colonies to the south of us fought a war with the British. Some of our leaders signed a treaty at Watertown, agreeing to assist the rebels against the British. Others refused. In any case, even in the communities where the leaders had signed, very few actually fought. Probably they no longer believed that any of the Europeans would do well by us. When the war ended, a huge wave of new settlers came in, and we lost more and more land. The treaties had specified that we were to be left our traditional lands. But as settlers came in, the British scarcely bothered at first to set aside land for us. Pushed aside by the white settlers who took our lands and killed the remaining animals that we had relied on, many of our people began to die from starvation. Without animal skins, we suffered terribly in the cold. Settlers took many of our men to work their farms in exchange for food, but by then my father was too weak for them to take interest in having him work. He starved to death just before the measles epidemic that took my mother, my baby brother, and my little sister. There was nobody left of my family but myself and one sister. Over and over, I see how extraneous we are to the order that they are imposing. Like the animals, like the trees, we are to be cut down, destroyed. I try not to think, try not to access my heart's knowledge. That knowledge could destroy me, as my family was destroyed. Each day as the sun rises, I'm determined to survive. The English could not regulate our trade with the sailors from Annapolis Royal, however, as Port Royal was now renamed, and many of the younger women left Ulsitcook then to be closer to the ships. My sister and I went with them after our parents died. We could think of nowhere else to go. We walked and walked, faint with hunger, our feet leaving bloody footprints, which soon were washed away in the fall rain. The woman who had gone before us had set up a wigwam in the woods nearby, and we all crowded into it. I shuddered for a long time with the warmth of body heat, but nothing could warm my hands and feet. For that, I need food. They let my sister and I stay with them in these wigwams filled with survivors from different communities, trading sex for food and blankets. My sister and I could not rent ourselves to the sailors, however. Most of the women who went with the sailors had a dress to wear, no matter how rough. They were thin, as we all were, but they weren't skeletal like we were. It may be that our community was the hardest hit, or maybe it was just our bad luck to lose our entire family. The fact is, my sister and I were so bony and wrapped in rags that the other women did not expect us to contribute. And yet, through their kindness, they helped us out, sharing some of their food with us. Soon, however, most of them had a new disease. One of the women who'd been very much weakened by hunger before she started going with the sailors got sick very fast. She was blind before she died. Another one died fast too, but she was raving insane, us holding her down in her madness. Despair stared us in the face, struggling to restrain a dying woman when we were all that was left. Winter came, and we gave our blankets to the women who went to the ships so they would be well wrapped, enough to survive the trip there and back. The rest of us huddled together, our bodies keeping us warm. And as the women shared their food, their menses came back. But as the dreadful months of winter slowly gave way to spring, none of the women were getting pregnant. The hope that spring has always brought appeared stillborn that spring. We all believe that the disease makes them sterile. I thought I'd seen everything. The deaths from all of the different illnesses that hunger and cold have brought to our communities. But it seems now even this means of acquiring food brings disease and loss of children. My mother, before she died, used to tell me how many more Mi'kmaq people there were when she was young. We were numerous then. And she told me that the elders had often told stories of times when we occupied all of this land, when there were many hundreds of thousands of us. There were only a few dozen people left at Ulsitcook when my sister and I left. In our wigwams near the ships, with women from other communities, we hear it's the same all over, that so many people have died of epidemics or vanished to the bounty hunters that we are becoming a tiny people. If we do not find a better mean to get food than this, our race may not survive. My sister Marguerite and I knew we could not indefinitely stay there taking food from those who worked with the sailors. Marguerite had heard about a settlement called Digby, where black men had settled. With some of the food the woman had given us, we set out in late spring to walk there. Hunger drove us every step. Begging was our only hope. The black people came here at the same time that all the white people came after the war with the English. They had actually fought on the side of the English. When we heard this later, we could not believe our ears. But they told us they only did that because they would be freed from slavery if they did. They were part of an all-black company called the Black Pioneers. Most of them had built small, rough log cabins. They had a few chickens, each had a small food garden and dories for fishing. We came to beg for scraps, hoping they would lack the cruelty of white men. Instead, seeing our desperate hunger, they simply began inviting us to share their food. I think maybe they're lonely for women, because so many of the soldiers have settled here. There are more men than women here. Or perhaps from the slavery they endured, they recognize starvation when they see it. It was summer after we got near their settlement. We built a little lean-to in the woods with some saplings that we bent over and lashed to a few other trees using some vines. The leaves kept out the rain and at least some of the insects, although we were so grimy and skinny that we were seldom bothered by them. Marguerite, 2 years younger than me, is a flirty young thing. The two of us make a fine pair, though, both of us wrapped in old blankets with little but rags on underneath. Our bony hips jut from the blankets as we wrap them tight in a vain attempt to keep warm. I'm glad I cut off my hair when I lost my mother, as is customary when faced with the deaths of loved ones. A lot of it had fallen out lately. At least now with it short, I may keep whatever hair I have left. What I hate the most is that my teeth are becoming loose. I've lost a couple already, and my breath is becoming terrible. It doesn't matter if I steep the leaves and roots of the bayberry to rinse my mouth. My breath stays foul. I saw this with my father. I think it means my body is consuming itself because there's nothing else for it to eat. But my heart is still beating steadily, however. My father's heart hurt him terribly when he died. Marguerite visits with William Black, whose little cabin is nearby, but I enjoy spending time with John Waddell, a man in his early 30s, with beautiful dark brown skin. He's a fine man who teases me incessantly, even as he feeds me chicken stew and dumplings, just a little at a time, knowing by the state of me that I haven't had good food in a long, long time. Girl, you ain't nothing but a bone. Look at you, he says teasingly. I toss my short hair. I have eaten dinner with him for the past 3 days, and I have to keep the conversation light to avoid weeping with gratitude. I may be skinny, but these are fine bones. He laughs at that. Be polite. Take off your blanket when you sit down, girl. He knows I have almost nothing on underneath. I tighten the blankets instead. You're dying to see these bones, aren't you? So our teasing goes, but underneath we're watching each other. He always gives me a piece of soap and toweling in a basin so I can draw water from the pump at the settlement well to wash my face before he gives me some food, and I drink lots of water there. The first time I came, he left his little hut for a few minutes so that I could wash all over. The nearest brook to our lean-to was a half-an-hour walk, and most times we were just too tired to walk to it. He always calls me girl or gal, as he pronounces it. Sometimes he calls me Molly. I don't think he realizes that my name is Malie. I don't mind. I'm happy with the name Molly, and I like the way he calls me girl. There's a real sweetness to it. After we eat and chat a while, he always walks me back down the road and through the woods to our lean-to. He left me a bucket so I can at least have water regularly at the lean-to, and he brought a tinder box so we could light a fire. I light it every night now, and he sits beside me and chats, waiting for Marguerite to come home. I lie down on the ground for the night, incredibly happy to have been fed, despite the insects that now notice me more with my clean skin and the food in my body. He always invites me back for the next evening's meal casually, as if it wasn't keeping me alive. I eat ravenously now that I'm more accustomed to food. He cooks for 3 just to provide for the 2 of us. I have no idea how much he can afford to feed me, and I can't care at this point. I don't know what I will do when he loses interest in me. One night a few weeks after I met him, he surprised me by giving me a small cloth parcel. When I opened it, to my shock, I saw a deep blue dress, the color of the sky just before dark settles in. I cried then. Tears I'd forgotten I knew how to shed. How did you get this? I asked. One of the men here, his wife who came up with us, was a seamstress. I got the material in town and she made it up for me. I could only guess your size, he told me, suddenly diffident. I tried it on. It hung on me, but it was beautiful. It's been so long that I've lived only in blankets with only a shred of my mother's dress hanging on my bony shoulders to keep me warm. I was overwhelmed and speechless. Girl, don't you worry about it. It didn't cost nothing. And I'll take you somewhere that you can show it off someday, he promised me solemnly. You're still just a bone, he finally teased me to make me laugh through my tears. That night, John talked about his own situation here and those of the other men. All of us, the black pioneers, were soldiers in the British Army. Afterwards, when all of us black folks sailed here with the white folks, they promised to give us all land when we arrived. That hasn't happened yet. The white settlers all got land and have been farming for a long while. They're all doing well while we're just scraping by. None of that land belonged to the British to give away, I said bitterly. It was all our land. and now we have almost nothing for ourselves. They've hunted us down like animals for our scalps and starved us into submission. I've heard in some of the communities where they're getting some poor relief that they can eat enough to clear their land. They do the work, and then when they come back from hunting or fishing, they find that white people have taken over the cleared land and called it theirs. Our law has been nullified by the British, and the Mi'kmaq people have no recourse in British law when that happened. As I looked at him, I smiled. But I reckon we would have provided your people with as much land as you needed, just because you seem to be good people. You share your bounty so generously with us. I think that our people and yours are very much alike. John thought a little. They never told us, of course, that the land was stolen from your people. They acted like it was all theirs to give. He spoke decisively suddenly, as if he'd been thinking of something for a long time, and finally made up his mind about it. Molly, there's nothing for black men here. They're not going to give us any land, and I think they want eventually to just have us servants for the whites. None of us wants that. I'm thinking of heading to Massachusetts. It's not English anymore, and I've heard that Indian communities down there are friendly to black men. They aren't starving there either, so we could get by much easier. Would you come with me if I went there? There was not really any question in my mind. It's not just that he had fed me, clothed me too, and that I enjoyed being with him. It's that I could see no future here in my own land. I never envisaged that I was leaving our land for good, but I knew that some of us would not survive any other way. John had wanted us to be married in the Christian way. I believe that after his experience with slavery, which he won't talk about, his religion gives him strength. And I don't believe his God is the same as the white God. For me, though, it's different. Although we had relied on the Patrias at Elsitcook and appreciated his basic goodness, I believe that the choice involved in Membertoo's treaty still applies. We do not have to follow the Catholic Manitous or any Christian Manitous if we do not want to. And I did not want to. In truth, I no longer wanted anything that the Europeans, French or English, had brought to our lands. In this matter of spirituality, we both respected the other's beliefs and left it at that. And so in early summer, with John's friends and my sister gathered around us, we pledged our troth to each other, without a patrias being involved. We shared a meal that John and his friends had provided for us to celebrate. We lived through the winter in Digby together before setting out in late spring. Saying goodbye to my sister wasn't easy, but it wasn't as hard as I had expected. Marguerite was wrapped up in her destiny with William Black, as I was with John. We hugged each other, neither of us as bony as we had been. We both spontaneously whispered something in each other's ear as we parted. Survive, we both wished each other. And then John and I set off. John said it was easily a 2-month walk to get to Cape Cod. We were lucky to meet up with a Wolastoqiyik fisherman who agreed to take us down the coast to the peninsula that he called Machigan. The whites called it Casco. It poured the entire trip, and we wondered how we would last if it kept raining. But we were lucky. The weather cleared during our long first walk down the coast. We carried all of John's goods on our back. We stopped on beaches to dig clams. Some salmon were still running, so with some of his cord, we worked together to knot a small net. Wading into the mouth of the next river, feet burning with the cold, I nevertheless caught a few. We roasted them in a small fire that we built against the low cliff back of the beach, ate our fill. What was left, we ate the following day. After that, it was leaner pickings. I scavenged different kinds of shellfish in different sites, went inland for a couple of days so I could dig some edible roots. Whenever we reached a river, I would set my net. I also fashioned a rough spear from 2 pieces of wood lashed with dried plant fiber, coated with some of the tallow that John had rendered and kept after he and his friends killed a settler's sheep covertly and carried it back to the community during last winter's lean days. Between the net and spearing other fish, we would gorge on fresh fish, then survive on small pickings until we reached the next river. In this way, we crept our way along the coast. We were very careful going through Boston. For me, it was the seat of so much of the evil that had come our way from the colonial government there. It didn't matter to me that they had broken away from Britain. John was also worried about going through it. As he told me, while slavery had ended in British colonies, it was still legal in Massachusetts. There had been very few slaves held there for many years, but he did not want to take any chances. Nor did he want to take chances with me. He told me there had been many native slaves on the last plantation where he had been enslaved. We therefore avoided the larger places and passed through Boston late at night, very carefully and quietly, keeping to the shadows, even if it took a long, long time to get through that way. Further on down the shore we trudged, John relying on my scavenging and fishing to keep us fed. Finally, out on Cape Cod one morning at the beginning of summer, we came to Mashpee. Thank you. So I'll pass it on to Margaret now.
Thanks, Bonita. We'll take another round of questions from Marie and Sean now, and I encourage those of you who are joining us to write any questions that you have for Bonita into the question screen. We'll start again with Marie Batiste. You're up, Marie.
Okay. All I can say is when you read again, read slow, because basically there's a lot of nuances that are missed by the swiftness of your read. And I know that, we're trying to get through a particular time, but I think that you need to enrich the read with giving pause to things. What struck me at the beginning of was the depiction of women. I think women are when I think of a woman's life, I think in Mi'kmaq, that you captured well the fear that Mi'kmaq women had of white men. My own mother, often would, when anybody knocked at the door, she would grab us and take us into the pantry, and we would stand there, and she would say to us, and it didn't need to be a sound more than a lip looking like that said, be absolutely still, do not move, do not chance. And I recall that, and it reminded me of that first piece that you did there about how we learn to be silent and how we learn fear. And in those years, I was learning from her how to fear the others that we were coming in contact with. And so fear has been very deep and wide, and living in our villages in the forest was in part to keep the women safe, keep children safe, keep us away from those particular communities of people. But I think it was the deep also that I would have loved to have seen and heard more of the positive sides of Mi'kmaq generosity, the deep family values connecting to how, you didn't need to be a relative as much as a friend, that immediately people would take you in and give and share of their bounty, that Mi'kmaq people still do today. You don't even need to know the people in the community. You could go to the first house on the reserve and they would take you in and offer you their family, both as shelter as well as the brotherhood of or sisterhood that it gave, in that particular place. So I don't know where you're going to go with this, and I'm imagining there are many scenarios that you have in your head that ways things could go into a sequel. And I can't imagine you letting this drop into abyss and not continue to do this writing. But what will you do to create an authentic Indigenous voice? Because when you write and you speak so beautifully in English and say, oh, and they learned all these multiple languages with ease. No, they don't. Actually, it comes because of the relationships you have with people that gathers up this loving learning of a language that then you can pick it up. But if you didn't have that loving, thing, then you're not going to be wanting to have this language. So how did you learn Arabic, or how did you learn all these multiple languages without the love of a family, without the loves and connections with them? So I'm wondering, in your dreaming of the next book, what kinds of authentic cultural experiences you want to have in order to make this a better experience in the book.
I think that I think I would have to spend a lot more time in Mi'kmaq, hopefully after the epidemics, right? Because yeah, I mean, the first character who learns languages, he did grow up with a loving family until he was 16. He learned that. And I've tried to talk through the book about that generosity. I have a character who's retelling the story that I told in this chapter, and she's talking about it wasn't accidental that the women shared their food. And the only way we did survive was because we always shared, and it was taught to us that we shared. So I've had some sense of that, but I think to do more, I'd have to spend more time in Mi'kmaq because, I mean, my instinctive thing is to say Chimigwech, not to say Walalin, right? Because I'm surrounded with Anishinaabe people here. So I think that's how I think I would do that. That you can only really do that through relationships in the territory. I did the best I could with relationships here, or not here, in Toronto, right? Initially, and then through research, and then through all of the words from other Mi'kmaq people, but it doesn't substitute. And that's why I had everybody leaving, right? That spending time elsewhere, assuming they had grown up in their communities, had those values, and then went elsewhere, because I couldn't write about, being in a community for life, because it's not what I know, right? So I think to go further, and I would like to, I think I'd have to spend more time. I'd thought in terms even of communities, but also I'm interested in what young urban people in Mi'kmaq, how much they know. Like I was thinking that for my next research project, I would like to spend time there, learn more from communities, but also find out what young urban people in the cities, in Halifax, in Jipuktuk, in other places like that, that I'd like to know about them too. But I think to do anything, I have to spend a lot of time there, obviously, which would be really nice. The last time I was in Mi'kmaq, it really struck me that even from the driving through in a car, Mi'kmaq people wave to you. You don't get that. Ojibwe people don't do that. Ojibwe people are wonderful, but Mi'kmaq people, it seems, are so friendly. It's quite phenomenal. So, yeah, I think that's what I'd have to do. Thank you, though.
My son, when we came to Saskatoon, that was the thing, is we were saying hello to every Indigenous person on the street. Hello, hello, shaking your head as you walk by. But there were so many of them here that basically they would look at you like, what are you doing, kind of thing. And eventually my friend said, we don't do that here. We just don't do the acknowledging of everybody who walks by or drives by. and that was interesting, because when my son came back then here, he said, I'm going to learn Cree. I'm going to learn Cree. I'm going to learn Cree. I'm going to know Cree. And I'm going to have all this. And I said, Jaime, they're different. They're just different. They're not.
Yeah.
It's not going to be up as you had it back home. And while they are loving, kind, and generous people here, they are definitely different. Mi'kmaq, Ojibwe, and even as you go farther, west, each have a different kind of sociability that is wonderful, but also very quiet. They don't give you a lot of eyes, they don't give you a lot of face, and they don't give you a lot of talk. So it's interesting. But yes, and going to Cape Breton University would be a wonderful place for you to spend some years. I'll pass it on to Sean.
Thank you for that, and thank you, Bonita, for that reading. I'll have a very quick comment, and then I'll throw out the last question for you. I'm just cognizant of time here, but I was really captured by the richness and the depth of the traditional knowledge, activities, and skills that you start to depict. And I'm really sad that you ended where you did, because immediately after this, you talk about how this couple now lands in Massachusetts, and how they're immediately embraced by an Indigenous community there, and how the first thing they do is offer food, and they say, oh, you're hungry, please come in, we need to feed you. And how they're very conscious of, oh, we want to take your food, and they say no, like this is who we are, we're bonded together by our Indigenous shared experiences and histories. And I think that was a very powerful aspect for me, and the connection that I think we all have as Indigenous peoples to food and the richness of culture and community together. And so the last question I have is a plug for you, and that is going to be for those that are watching and with us here tonight, to tell us a little bit about the publisher and where they can go and actually find this book as we close out the event.
I think it's on the website, right? I mean, you can order it online. There were two bookstores that originally had them order the book, but they don't have any copies. The two Halifax bookstores, but and I think I might have tried for some in New Brunswick as well. But if not, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, you know, they all, and on the website you can click on it and you'll find the book, so you don't have to think about how does it spelled. You know? But yeah, okay. Thank you, Sean. Yeah. Margaret, I don't know if there's other questions then.
I have a few questions. I noticed that several sections of your novel take up a character's relation to the proximity to water. So there's the Thames, you've got Halifax Harbor, there's a canoe trip, there's the river. What role do you see water playing when you were writing the novel?
I guess it's because I mean, my mother grew up beside the ocean. She was actually terrified watching me swim, right? Because, you know, she had learned a healthy fear from growing up in Shediac and then Moncton, right? You know, so I think that when I think of Mi'kma'ki, I think much more because, you know, the Atlantic provinces, I mean, the ocean is there, you know. It's funny, yeah, I haven't really thought of that so much, about that relationship to water, but it's so important, you know. So yeah, thank you.
And thank you. And my second question is, I love how your novel normalizes Mi'kmaq sexual practices. What was your aim when it came to representing sexuality in your book?
I'm a little, I mean, I think I was influenced a lot by ideas that with colonization came a very narrow idea about sexuality. And, you know, I think I'm careful to say in my epilogue in talking that I really don't know if, you know, pre-contact Mi'kmaq people were free to experiment with their sexuality, provided they kept their hearts free. And that when the elders started to notice that women especially were starting to feel things a bit too much, that's when they had to stop. And that's when they had to think about who are you going to be partnered with, you know. And I guess it was people like Beth Brandt. She was a Mohawk writer. Lee Markle talked a lot about West Coast. She said in her community, often the men had another partner and the women had another partner too. That basically, so I think that with colonization came that. And yet at the same time, I'm really aware, I mean, so many Mi'kmaq people are Catholic, right? And I don't know how people would read what I wrote about pre-contact Mi'kmaq people. So I'm kind of careful in the end to say, this is my idea of it. And it's based on what I've learned from this one and that one and the other. But I really don't know if this was how Mi'kmaq people, you know, did that. But I do include sexuality, of course. You know, the first chapter that I wrote has, you know, kind of some passionate sex going on in there. And as I say, I've wondered how I'm teaching it in my class, and my students will be reading that chapter next week, and I'm, you know, kind of aware that they might. It's intense, but it's actually only a couple of paragraphs. But you know, yeah, I do explore sex a few times in the book, you know. Yeah.
We've got some questions coming in. One is, how do we get this book in our local libraries? So the person says, I have a copy myself, but I've requested it at the library. How can they get their
I
book?
think that, I mean, it had to be published in England. It had to be published in England, in part because, you know, it was such a big book that most of the Canadian presses couldn't handle it, and because it's part of it does take place there. Unfortunately, then they really pitched it as an English thing more than a Mi'kmaq thing, which, I mean, I didn't feel that good about, but what the heck. I think that they can ask the publisher, and I can provide that information. I mean, it's Austin Macaulay. They're the ones who would send the book. There's actually, but there is also, I think, people who wholesale it. When I ordered the book for York University, they had found a wholesaler. So I think that they could begin by starting with Austin Macaulay in London and find out where they distribute it, you know, in Canada. I think that'd be the best way. They have American distributors as well, right? But no press in Canada itself. So but there are wholesalers, I think, at bookstores can use.
So we should all encourage our libraries to run out and get your book. And there's well-wishing from Rob LeBlanc, who wants to wish you all the best from Sinatug, Sackville, New Brunswick. Congratulations, grateful to know you.
Yeah, that's nice.
Lovely. I think that's all the questions in the comment section. So if we're content, then I think we can start to wrap up. The many thank yous. Walal and Bonita, I can't thank you enough for doing this work. And I want to thank Kathy Martin for singing us into our event tonight. I want to thank Sings to the Forest for those great introductions. And I want to thank the discussants, Marie Batiste and Sean Hillier, for coming with their questions. I want to thank the Dalhousie production team, James Wilson, Deborah Hemming, Samantha Adema, and Marlo McKay. Your expertise made tonight look easy. So walaliak to all of you. Thanks to everyone who came with listening ears on and brought their questions. Walaliak to all of you. Big thanks to Benita Lawrence for sharing her art and her time with us this evening. And I'm reminded of the words of Mi'kmaq poet Rita Joe, who wrote, "Look at us and you too will find the good." And I think your novel brings the good of the Mi'kmaq to a wider audience. So I appreciate and thank you for that. And now I'll turn it back to Catherine Martin, who will sing us home again. Over to you, Catherine.
Well, that's been a great way to end the day, this part of the day anyway. And I'd like to thank you. When I saw the film Rabbit Proof Fence, I said, oh my God, everybody needs to see this because it's so much like what it just brings to life the truth because you have people and maybe the general population who some don't believe things happened and others just couldn't really conceive of it when it's a drama, when it's based on historical facts, but it's dramatic. It just changes the way, hopefully the way people understand the Mi'kmaq, why we are the way we are, and it's a great way. There's no doubt about that. When I heard some of the parts of your book resonated with me because I have spent a long time learning about my own family's trauma at Tufts Cove in Turtle Grove during the Halifax explosion. And some of what you wrote can just be one of those, my family. So I thank you for that. And I'm going to thank you with a chant that Donna Augustine of Elsa Buktuk from, your area of your mother's taught to me. And I'd like to remind everyone that she taught that to me, and thank you. Yo ya hi ya yo ya hi yo ya hi ya yo ya hi yo ya hi Thank you, Great Spirit, for thunder in the sky. time and for the night. And thanks for the way of our lives. Yo ya yeah, yo ya yeah. Yo ya yeah, yo ya yeah. Yo ya yeah, yo ya yeah. Yo ya yeah, yo. Yo ya yeah, yo. No.
Tahoe.
Again, when I drum, something always comes to me. And what Margaret, by you saying something about Rita Joe, it just brought back to me, oh yes, this is one thing I wanted to tell you. Behind me is the Mi'kmaq petroglyph at the Bedford Barrens, which is at a little further up from the Sackville River and Fort Sackville, where Gorham's soldiers were mostly hanging out. And the petroglyph is up, way up high, and when you're up there, you can see over the basin and you can see people coming in. And this particular place I often went to, and I brought people to do ceremony to try to learn what that space was and why somebody took so much time to do what they did there. Anyway, long story short, I brought Sarah Denny and Rita Joe together with others, but I remember they were the two I brought to do a ceremony. And we went to the Barrens, but then we went down to it was like a marsh, and lots of cranberries were there, but it was marshy. And that's where Sarah said, this is where we do the ceremony. So we did the ceremony, and Rita Joe said, when Sarah was doing her ceremony, I heard a little girl up in the tree crying.
Oh my God.
And Sarah said, this is not where we were, but the Bedford Basin. There was horrible things that happened down there. It wasn't just for our people, it was the French and the soldiers, and a lot of death happened on that shoreline, and she was telling us that. And Rita said, well, this was a little girl, and she was crying up in a tree. And so when you read that part, I thought, the Barrens themselves offer this place where you can hide behind the rock, and you can look up and you can see if anyone's coming in. And so I just said, wow, that's amazing. And it certainly told me that the spirits of our ancestors are very happy that we're trying to tell that story now for them. And so I loved your book, and I'm going to try to find it. And I also want to say one more thing. Samantha Adema is back there. She won't show her face, but I've known her since she was born, and she's now our Indigenous Mi'kmaq librarian at Dalhousie University. And it really just makes me so happy to see that. So thanks, Sam. I know you're just probably red as a beet. All right. Well, Alio, nice to see you, Marie,
so
and everybody
much.
else.
Thank you.
My